At one of the most high-pressure political gatherings of the year, former Vice President Mike Pence suddenly steps forward and hurls a public insult straight at current Vice President J.D. Vance, a confrontation so abrupt it freezes the entire room. But before the moment can spiral further, Vance delivers a single calm, razor-sharp line. A line that leaves Pence mute and the audience stunned. One sentence, yet powerful enough to jolt the direction of conservative politics. The summit had been expected to roll out like every other one. Speeches, applause, promises that may or may not survive the week. Inside the Capitol Grand Hall, chandeliers blazed overhead as some of the nation's most influential conservatives sat beneath a forest of cameras. President Donald Trump had just finished his address to thunderous applause. And next on the agenda was Vice President J.D. Vance. But before Vance could even approach the podium, a voice sliced across the hall. Mike Pence. Moving toward the microphone without invitation, as though he still owned the stage. "Let's stop pretending," Pence announced, his tone dripping with condescension. "Everyone here knows J.D. Vance isn't a leader. He's just Trump's obedient little puppet." The crowd sucked in a collective breath. Senators, reporters, and every camera in the room pivoted toward the brewing showdown. Vance stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Pence, clearly impressed with himself, flashed a smug half-smile. "You've got no backbone, Vance. You're just another tag-along hoping for crumbs." Silence. A deep, uncomfortable one. Even the Secret Service exchanged puzzled glances. Then slowly, J.D. Vance stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He didn't even look irritated. He simply murmured a single line, quiet, cold, and sharp enough to crack the air like glass. And from that second on, the entire moment flipped. Vance locked eyes with Pence, his voice low but carrying cleanly across the hushed room. "Mike, if loyalty to a great man makes me a puppet, then what does that make you? A traitor with no strings or a volunteer for the other side?" Another round of gasps louder than before. Someone in the back dropped their glass. Pence's jaw tightened. And Vance was nowhere near finished. "I stood with a president who stood with this country," Vance said, his voice steady. "You?" The moment the political winds shifted, you sprinted straight into the arms of people who despise everything you once claimed to stand for. His tone never rose, but every word landed like a shockwave. Reporters started hammering their keyboards. Senators leaned in, wide-eyed. "You accused me of obedience," Vance continued, "but you obeyed fear. I followed the truth, and unlike you, I never sank a knife into the backs of the American people." Pence's lips twitched. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Then the room reacted. At first, a few quiet claps, then a rising wave of applause. Backstage, President Trump simply nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. This wasn't a war of words anymore. It was war. Pence turned to leave, desperate to escape the floodlights. But J.D. Vance stepped forward again. He wasn't done. "You want to talk about loyalty, Mike?" Vance asked, his voice cool and cutting. "Where were you in 2020? When cities burned? When the media twisted the truth? When everyday Americans lived through hell? Where were you?" He didn't give Pence a chance to answer. "You hid behind speeches while real Americans suffered." The cameras caught everything. The live stream viewer count shot past 2 million. Pence turned back, mumbling, "You don't understand what leadership requires." "No," Vance snapped. "You don't understand what it means to stand." He scanned the room. Leadership isn't chasing applause or dodging responsibility. It's doing what's right when it's unpopular, when it costs you something. You used to believe that, before you sold your name to people who will never respect you. Pence's face drained to chalk. And then Vance delivered the knockout blow. "You were Donald Trump's vice president, Mike. Now you're the Democrats' errand boy. And history won't let that slide." In that instant, Pence looked like a man who realized he'd already lost. The room wasn't merely shocked, it was bruised. Whispers spread. Reporters huddled. Senators exchanged uneasy glances. Pence stood rigid beside the podium, realizing he had walked straight into a political ambush. J.D. Vance moved past him, turning toward the audience and the cameras. "This isn't about me," he said steadily. "It's about truth. And the truth is this. Some men hold the title of vice president, while selling the soul of the office just to keep their dinner invitations from the other side. Pence clenched his jaw. His eyes darted toward a group of donors, some of whom were already turning away from him. And J.D. Vance still wasn't finished. You didn't just betray President Trump. You betrayed the voters who trusted you to protect them, especially when it was difficult. And now you have the nerve to call me a puppet. A young woman in the crowd burst into tears. She remembered losing her job during the lockdowns, while Pence stayed silent. J.D.'s words had landed like a blade. This party isn't perfect, he said, turning to the crowd. But what we don't need are deserters. We need fighters. And I'm not about to let the man who ran from the battlefield rewrite our history. The room exploded in applause. Pence, meanwhile, seemed to shrink into himself. Mike Pence inhaled shakily. His voice cracked as he spoke. You think you understand what it was like sitting in my chair? You weren't there, J.D. You didn't feel the pressure, the chaos. I did, Vance cut in. And I stood firm. The hall froze all over again. Pence's hand trembled as he jabbed a finger toward Vance. You're a child in politics. You coasted on Trump's name. I helped build that legacy. You're just walking around in shoes you didn't earn. J.D. Mouth tightened into a thin line. Then quietly, almost too quietly, the difference is, I never spat on the man who gave me the shoes. A ripple moved through the hall, a low, electric murmur. J.D. stepped forward. You keep acting like you carried the weight. But when the moment came, you let the media write the ending. You handed them the pen. A few people nodded. A veteran in the back stood up and clapped just once, but it echoed. J.D. addressed the room. Leadership isn't about dodging pain. It's about standing in the middle of it and still saying, I won't back down. Pence looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He tried to smile, but it faltered. Even he could feel it. He was losing control of the room. Then J.D. turned slightly, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a thin folder. This, he said, holding it up, is a set of communications between former Vice President Pence's office and multiple Democrat-led committees dated just weeks after January 6th. Gasps shot across the room. Long before he told America he was praying for wisdom, J.D. continued, he was negotiating speaking fees. A journalist in the front row stood so fast her chair screeched, camera flashing. Pence's eyes went wide. That's classified, he barked. Not anymore, Vance replied, ice cold. The redacted version was cleared last night. I made sure of it. Transparency isn't betrayal, Mike. Smiling while lying is. He set the folder calmly on the podium. This isn't revenge, it's revelation. The country deserves to know who you became once the cameras stopped rolling. Pence's shoulders collapsed inward. He had no argument left. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was a verdict. Backstage, even Trump leaned to an aide and whispered, he just ended Pence's career. The truth had landed. And Pence finally understood something brutal. He hadn't insulted J.D. Vance. He had awakened him. After Vance revealed the folder, the hush in the hall turned into a low storm. Whispers spread seat to seat. He had proof? Pence really did that? Why would he cut deals with the same people who called him a traitor? J.D. didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply stood there letting the truth do the talking. He looked weighed down like a man carrying truths he wished he never had to reveal. Pence stepped back from the microphone, color draining from his face. His hand drifted to his suit pocket, fumbling for something that wasn't there. The stage lights seemed to burn hotter across his forehead. Several senators glanced away, ashamed of the man they had once championed. Even a pastor from Indiana, who had flown in just to support Pence, lowered his head and folded his hands in silent disappointment. Vance cleared his throat. Mike, he said, you called me a puppet. But puppets don't uncover the truth. Traitors hide it. An older woman in the front row, wearing a small American flag pin, wiped tears from her eyes. Pence tried to speak again, but his voice fractured. This isn't fair. But J.D. Vance had only begun. He turned back to the audience, taking in the mix of shock, anger, and heartbreak written across their faces. I never wanted it to reach this point, he said quietly, but we cannot heal a nation while shielding the very people who helped wound it from the inside. He didn't point a finger, he didn't have to. His words did it for him. When the Capitol was under siege by lies, you chose silence. When Americans needed strength, you gave them statements crafted by consultants, and when it mattered most, you turned your back on the man who trusted you and the people who believed you'd defend them. The crowd stood frozen. Vance's eyes landed on a young man holding a framed military photo. "That's your brother, isn't it?" The young man nodded. "He served this country while people like Mike Pence made backroom deals. And that is why I won't stay silent any longer." Gasps rippled through the hall, then applause. The applause grew, rising into a thunderous standing ovation. Pence's eyes darted toward the exit. He looked like a man drowning in a storm he thought he could tame. But JD wasn't finished. The truth still had more to say. As the applause settled, a new current swept through the room. The back doors opened and in walked President Donald J. Trump. He didn't speak. He simply strode down the center aisle, his expression unreadable. Cameras swiveled toward him. The crowd shifted. Pence, visibly tensed. J.D. Vance stepped aside, nodding once in respect. Trump stepped to the podium, scanning the room before allowing his eyes to land briefly on Pence. "You know," Trump began, "I've been watching from backstage, and I've never been prouder of a vice president than I am right now." JD's face showed no pride, only resolve. Trump placed a firm hand on Vance's shoulder. "Loyalty isn't blind obedience," he said. "It's standing up for what's right, even when it's ugly, even when it hurts." Then Trump turned fully toward Pence. "I trusted you, Mike. And you broke that trust. But the worst part, you didn't just break mine. You broke America's." Pence looked away, unable to meet his eyes. And then Trump delivered the line that froze the entire hall. "You called JD a puppet. Today, he pulled your strings without ever laying a finger on you." The crowd split wide open, some cheering, others crying, and suddenly the entire room belonged to JD Vance. No coughing, no whispers, not a single shuffle. The whole country was watching live. Every major network cut into their shows. Twitter was melting down. YouTube streams were exploding by the second. Pence stood there blinking fast, like he was trying to reboot the moment. But the camera refused to blink with him. JD Vance stepped behind the podium, President Trump standing close by with his arms folded like a verdict waiting to be read. "America isn't perfect," JD said, eyes sweeping the crowd, drilling straight through every live stream lens. "We've been bruised, we've been lied to. But nothing cuts deeper than betrayal from the people we once called brothers." He didn't spare Pence a glance. "And when a man chooses applause from the other side over loyalty to the truth," JD added, "he shrinks smaller than his own shadow." Someone in the crowd stifled a sob. Pence looked again toward the exit again, but he couldn't move. "Not yet." Vance lifted the folder. "This isn't personal. It hurts, but it has to be done. America can't heal with the same people who helped break her." Tears were falling now, and the story was only tightening its grip. As the applause faded, a man in a wheelchair was rolled forward by his teenage daughter. JD noticed. He paused. "Sir, would you like to speak?" The man took the mic. His voice was gravelly, worn by years. "I served under 3 presidents. I lost my leg in Afghanistan. But I didn't lose my faith, not until the day Mike Pence turned on President Trump." Gasps rippled through the room. He pointed at Pence. "You talked about courage, about country. But when the media storm hit, you ran." Pence couldn't meet his eyes. The man turned to JD. "You reminded me of something I thought this country had lost. Honor." JD blinked hard. He hadn't expected that. The daughter placed a hand on her father's shoulder. He whispered, "That's enough." JD stepped back to the podium, voice quieter now. "America isn't asking for perfect leaders. She's begging for honest ones." Even some of Pence's old allies in the front row bowed their heads. What began as a political event had turned into a national reckoning, truth laid bare through tears. Mike Pence had always been careful with his words, polished in tone, calculated down to the comma. But under the heat of Vance's truth and the weight of the people's grief, he cracked. "I tried to do what I thought was right," he muttered. "I didn't mean to." JD cut in, gentle but sharp. "You didn't mean to what, Mike? Trade truth for safety? Betray the people who trusted you? Let the media tell you who you were?" Pence's voice shook. I just didn't think Trump could win again. I didn't want to go down with him. Silence. JD stepped forward slowly, locking eyes with him. And that is why you don't belong here. Pence's lips quivered. He looked like he might fold in on himself. He glanced at Trump, nothing there but cold stone. He turned toward the crowd, but they were gone. Not physically, just no longer his. A few people stood up and turned their backs on him. J.D. Vance didn't cheer. He didn't grin. He simply lowered his gaze and whispered into the mic. Cowards run from fire. Leaders walk through it. And in that moment, it wasn't just Pence who was exposed. It was every lie he'd ever tucked away, every truth he'd ever dodged. Outside the Capitol Grand Hall, news vans lined the street like toppled dominoes. Reporters fired into their cameras breathlessly as breaking banners streaked across screens nationwide. Pence exposed by Vance in shocking live showdown. Trump stands with J.D. Vance in stunning moment. Inside, J.D. Vance sat beside Trump now. Pence stood off to the side, out of the center, out of the light, out of power. A reporter shouted from the press gallery, "Vice President Vance, do you believe Pence should be removed from the party?" J.D. looked up, voice steady, respectful but unyielding. "I think accountability is long overdue. Not from the left, from within." A ripple moved through the audience. He continued, "We don't lose elections just because the opposition lies. We lose them because of quiet betrayals dressed up as politeness." He turned briefly toward Pence, then faced the press again. "This isn't about punishment. It's about protecting the truth, so we don't lose the soul of conservatism forever." Pence sank into the shadows, hollowed out, while J.D.'s name surged forward like a storm no one could outrun. Backstage, an aide hurried over and handed J.D. a small folded letter. "It's from your father," she whispered. J.D. paused, took it, stepped aside. He opened it with trembling hands. "Son, I watched you today. I don't think I've ever cried that hard. Not because you were tough, but because you were gentle, even while you were hurting. That's what real men do. That's what I failed to teach you when you were young. But today, you became the man I always hoped you'd be. You didn't destroy Pence. You revealed him with truth, not hate. And I'm proud of you. Dad." J.D. wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. His throat tightened. Suddenly the cameras, the crowds, the roar, all of it dimmed. Behind every speech was a son. Behind every stand was a little boy who once needed a reason to believe again. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat. Now it wasn't just about defending Trump. It was about guarding America's future from men like Pence, and proving to every father and son watching that honesty still mattered. As the program broke for a short intermission, J.D. stepped into a quiet hallway. His phone buzzed a private call. He answered. "J.D. Vance." A woman's voice came through, cracking with tears. "Vice President, you don't know me," the woman said softly, "but I lost my husband last year. He was a firefighter, and he voted for Pence twice." J.D.'s heart dropped. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I need you to know something," she continued, her voice trembling. "Today, for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone stood up for the people again." J.D. closed his eyes. She wasn't finished. "My husband used to say, there are two kinds of leaders. The ones who talk, and the ones who carry people through fire." She inhaled shakily. "You carried us today." He couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too heavy to move. "Promise me you won't stop," she whispered. J.D. whispered back, barely audible, "I promise." When the call ended, he stood alone in the quiet hallway, staring at the blank wall. This wasn't about ego anymore. It wasn't even about politics. It was about healing something inside the country that had been cracked for years, and that healing had only just begun. The event resumed. Cameras rolled. Lights flared. But the entire atmosphere had shifted. Mike Pence rose slowly from his seat. No applause. No polite nods. Not even from the people who once swore loyalty to him. He walked down the center aisle like a forgotten ghost, and people turned their eyes away as he passed. He reached the exit doors and paused, as if hoping someone, anyone, would stop him. Say a word. Call his name. Nothing. Only silence. And inside that silence, the weight of everything he had done or failed to do crashed down like a storm. J.D. Vance remained near the stage, steady and composed. No gloating, no smirk, just a bowed head. A little boy, maybe 9 years old, tugged on his father's jacket. "Why is the man leaving?" he asked. His father knelt and whispered, "Because he forgot who he was." And JD reminded him. Pence pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the cold night air. No cameras followed. No microphones chased him. Just the sound of lonely footsteps and a door closing behind him. A chapter had ended, but JD's story was still being written by the people. After the final speech, JD moved slowly through the crowd, shaking hands, listening, nodding respectfully. An old veteran in a worn tan cap waited with a cane. His coat was weighted with medals: Vietnam, Iraq, and 2 for bravery. When JD reached him, the man didn't speak right away. He simply looked into JD's eyes. Then he extended his hand. "You spoke for all of us today," the old soldier said, voice unsteady. "I've waited years, to hear that kind of truth." JD gripped his hand firmly. "Thank you for your service, sir." "No, son," the veteran replied. "Thank you for finally serving us." His eyes watered. He turned to leave, limped a few steps, then paused. "Don't ever change. We can't afford to lose one more leader who's real." JD nodded, swallowing hard. He watched the man limp away, and then he saw it. People crying, not out of sadness, but because for once, someone hadn't let them down. A woman holding her toddler whispered. For the first time all day, JD Vance smiled a soft, quiet smile. He didn't need applause. He had the hearts of the people. Backstage, the weight of the day finally settled on his shoulders. He sat alone, slightly hunched forward, staring at the floor, and breathed out, slow and heavy. President Trump walked in quietly, carrying 2 glasses of water. He handed one to JD and sat down beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Trump finally broke the silence. "You didn't just defend me today," he said softly. "You defended something a lot bigger." JD looked over. "I just told the truth." Trump let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah, but the truth always comes with a price, and you paid it today." JD nodded once. "It was worth it." Trump grew still, then leaned closer. "They love you now, but don't let it change you. Stay the man who cried over a stranger's phone call, not the man chasing cameras." JD met his eyes. "I'm not here for power. I'm here to make sure no kid ever grows up feeling forgotten." Trump placed a firm hand on JD's back and stood up. "That's exactly why you'll go farther than all of them." JD sat there alone again, thinking, and he knew this moment wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something much, much bigger. Later that evening, JD Vance slipped into the back seat of a black SUV. Washington's streets looked calm under the streetlights, but his mind was anything but. His chief of staff, Lauren, sat in the front and glanced back. "Want to look over the headlines?" JD shook his head. "No, not tonight." Instead, he pulled out his father's folded letter again and reread it slowly. The driver spoke softly. "Sir, what you did tonight, no one's going to forget it." JD stared out the window. "I didn't come here to make people remember me. I came to help them remember who they are." The SUV glided past the Lincoln Memorial, glowing, silent, majestic, and JD felt history's weight pressing on him, not as a burden, but as a calling. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, crumpled sticky note, just 4 words. "Tell the truth, always." Something his mother had drilled into him when he was a boy. Tonight it meant more than ever. By midnight, JD's inbox had exploded, not with political chatter but with people. Veterans, teachers, coal miners, single moms, pastors. Some emails were only a sentence long. "You gave me hope. You said what we've been screaming for years. I watched with my son. We cried together." But one message stood out from a teenager in Kansas. "Mr. Vance, I've never cared about politics. My dad lost his job last year, and we felt forgotten. Tonight I saw you fight for people like us. For the first time, I feel like we matter again. Please don't ever stop." JD read it twice. Then he read it aloud. The entire room went silent. He looked around at his team. "This isn't about winning elections anymore," he said. "It's about restoring something broken in our people." They nodded, but behind a few of their eyes, there were tears. Because what happened earlier that day wasn't just a moment. It had become a movement. At 1:34 a.m., long after cameras went dark and the streets emptied, JD sat alone in the small chapel inside the vice president's residence. No staff, no noise, just JD and the quiet hum of the night. He lit a small candle, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. He didn't pray for power. He didn't ask for praise. He whispered, "God, keep me honest. Help me carry this the right way. And if I ever forget why I started, take it from me." He sat there for several minutes. No lightning, no booming voice, just stillness, just peace. Then the chapel door creaked open. President Trump stepped in wearing slippers and a coat. "Knew I'd find you in here," he said. JD smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep." Trump walked in and sat beside him, eyes lifting to the cross. "You think they're ready?" JD looked straight ahead. "I think they're desperate for something real." Trump stood, nodded once. "Then let's give it to them." And together, the two men left the chapel, not as politicians but as warriors. For something bigger than politics, something America had almost forgotten. By morning, J.D. Vance was seated for a nationwide interview with the country's most watched political anchor, Karen Dillard. Millions tuned in. "Vice President Vance," she began, "what was going through your mind when Mike Pence called you a puppet on stage?" J.D. leaned back, calm, steady, clear. "Honestly, I felt sad." "Sad?" Karen asked, surprised. "Yes," J.D. replied. "Not for me, for him. Because I saw a man who once stood beside a great president reduced to bitterness and pride. He chose applause from the wrong side over allegiance to the truth." Karen nodded slowly. "And what was the line you said that silenced the room?" J.D. paused. Everyone leaned in. "I said, 'You call me a puppet for standing by Trump, yet you sold your soul for a handshake from the people who spit on your values.'" The internet detonated. Twitter exploded with hashtags like #JD Truth and #John Pence Exposed. Karen inhaled sharply, almost emotional. "Sir, you may have changed the direction of the party." JD looked straight into the camera. "Not changed?" Reminded. The interview ended, but the movement didn't. The people's fire had been reignited. Afterward, JD hurried home briefly to see his wife and son before returning to D.C. As he tucked his 8-year-old into bed, the boy whispered, "Daddy, why did that man say you were bad?" JD froze. That question cut deeper than any headline. He sat on the edge of the bed. Because sometimes when you stand for what's right, people who are wrong try to make you look weak. The boy's eyes filled with tears. "But you didn't yell. You didn't hit him." JD smiled gently. "Because real strength doesn't scream. Real strength speaks the truth even when your voice shakes." The boy hugged him tightly. "You're my hero." JD swallowed hard, kissed his son's head. "No, son, you're mine." He turned off the lights and paused in the doorway. The weight of Pence's insult, the weight of America's pain, rested heavy on his shoulders. But so did love. And with that, he knew he had to go back into the fire. For every father, every mother, every child, still waiting for someone to finally fight for them. Meanwhile, miles away, Mike Pence sat in a lonely hotel room. No reporters, no invitations, no spotlight, just a phone buzzing occasionally, mostly with cancellations. Pence clicked on the TV. JD's interview filled the screen. The line echoed through the room like a slap. "You sold your soul for a handshake from the people who spit on your values." Pence shut it off immediately and tossed the remote aside. He looked toward a framed photo of himself and Trump from 2017, then turned to face the mirror. What stared back wasn't the confident man he used to be. It was someone hollow an outline of who he once was. He picked up his phone and dialed an old advisor from his vice president days. "They're done with you," the voice on the line said bluntly. "You're not the future. You're a shadow." Pence didn't argue. For the first time, he had no comeback, no spin. The betrayal he thought he could control had swallowed him instead, and the people had made their choice. They chose J.D. Vance. In a small Ohio town, Mrs. Langston stood before her 7th grade civics class. They had just finished watching clips from J.D.'s speech and interview. "All right, class," she asked softly. "What did you feel watching that?" A quiet girl in the backcon who almost never spoke raised her hand. "He made me feel like someone finally cared about real people. A boy whose father worked 2 jobs added, "It felt like he wasn't trying to sound smart. He was just telling the truth." Mrs. Langston nodded, eyes misting. "That's leadership. Not yelling, not pretending. Standing for something, even when others fold." On the classroom TV, JD's words replayed. "Cowards run from fire. Leaders walk through it." A student whispered, "I wish my uncle could have heard that before he gave up last year." Silence filled the room. In that moment, J.D. Vance wasn't just the vice president. He was hope. He was courage. He was what politics was supposed to be. None of them would forget it. Back at the Capitol, J.D.'s chief aide Lauren knocked gently on his office door. "Come in," J.D. said, sipping his coffee. She stepped inside with red, swollen eyes. "Sir, I need to say something." J.D. set the cup down. "What is it?" She sat, trying to steady her voice. "I used to believe in Pence. I campaigned for him, defended him. Even after he turned on President Trump, I made excuses." J.D. stayed silent, giving her space. "But after what you did yesterday," she stopped, emotion catching in her throat. "You reminded me why I got into this. It wasn't for status or media attention. It was to help people." J.D. stood, walked over, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We've all believed in the wrong people before. What matters is we don't stay there." She wiped her eyes. "You didn't just expose Pence. You healed something in us. Something we didn't realize was broken." J.D. nodded softly. "Then it was worth it." Outside the office, more staff waited, not for meetings, but because they believed again. Later that night, J.D. Vance was summoned to the Oval Office. President Trump stood by the window, staring out across the South Lawn. He didn't turn when J.D. entered. "You were incredible, J.D.," Trump said quietly. J.D. approached slowly. "Thank you, Mr. President." Trump finally turned around, and J.D. froze. His eyes were wet. A man known for his toughness was crying. "You reminded me of something I almost forgot," Trump said, voice thick. "That this fight isn't about us. It's about them. The forgotten, the hurting, the heartland." J.D. lowered his head. "They need someone real. Someone who won't leave them when it gets hard." Trump nodded, a tear slipping free. "And yesterday, they found him." The 2 men embraced not as politicians but as patriots bound by truth, loyalty, and a love for a country that had nearly lost its soul. And for the first time in years, the White House didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. Early the next morning, J.D. sat by his office window when an envelope marked "Urgent Hand Delivered" was placed on his desk. No return address, just a name scrawled in blue ink. Mason H., age 11, Nebraska. J.D. opened it carefully. The handwriting was crooked, childlike, but the words cut sharp. "Dear Mr. Vance, my dad used to believe in Mike Pence. We even had his sign in our yard. But after he turned on President Trump, my dad said he lost all hope. Yesterday, my dad cried when you spoke. I've only seen him cry once when Grandma passed away. He said you reminded him of who we are. He said he's proud to be an American again. Thank you for standing up when others were too scared. You're not a puppet. You're a warrior. Love, Mason." J.D. folded the letter and pressed it to his chest. No cameras were around. No audience. Just a man letting tears fall for the reason he fought, not for power, but for Mason, and every forgotten voice like his. Meanwhile, across the country, Mike Pence slipped out of the public eye. Scheduled interviews quietly evaporated. His staff thinned. Conference invitations dried up. Even old allies let his calls ring unanswered. One night, in the dim corner of a quiet Indiana diner, Pence sat alone, phone face down, his dinner untouched. A couple entered, noticed him, and quickly chose another table. He stirred his coffee, regret sinking deeper with every slow circle of the spoon. He remembered the podium, the bright lights, the confidence he once carried like armor. Now those memories tasted bitter. And the worst part? J.D. hadn't destroyed him with rage. He'd dismantled him with truth. Calm, steady, unflinching truth. Pence finally muttered to himself. I underestimated him, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The people had spoken, and there was no going back. Back in Washington, President Trump prepared for a national address. Behind him stood J.D. Vance, not in the background, but shoulder to shoulder. Trump spoke first. What we witnessed yesterday wasn't just a moment. It was a movement, and it was led by the man standing right next to me. Then Trump stepped aside. JD approached the podium. He glanced once at the teleprompter, then reached out and turned it off. "I don't need a script to speak the truth," he said. "America's tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of polished lies and silent cowards. We want courage again. We want clarity again. We want home again." He paused, voice thickening. "If standing with a president who put America first makes me a puppet, then call me one proudly. Because I'd rather be a puppet of truth than a master of betrayal." The room erupted. Some people sobbed. And across the nation, millions felt something they hadn't felt in years. Trust. The future had arrived. And its name was J.D. Vance. If this story moved you even a little, tap that like button. If J.D. Vance earned your respect, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which moment gave you chills or brought tears to your eyes. Do you believe J.D. Vance represents the future of conservative America? Share this with someone who needs hope. Your voice matters. Let's bring truth back together.